Good afternoon on this gorgeous fall day. I'm Michael Stein, professor of medicine, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the 21st annual Harriet W. Sheridan Award Lecture to be delivered by Dr. Robert J. Lifton. First, a little background. Harriet Sheridan was a professor of English at Brown, a scholar of medieval literature, and a dean of the college. Although I never met her, from all I've learned of Harriet Sheridan, her brilliant career in the teaching of reading and writing was marked by an interest in students having strongly held opinions, in their voicing dissent to others' strongly held opinions, and in the celebration of literature and discussion. In this light, her best-known undergraduate course was called Controversy and the Art of Reconciliation. Dr. Sheridan founded the Center for Teaching and Learning that now bears her name. Her involvement in medical studies became focused when she joined with the dean of the medical school, Lynn Epstein, to co-teach a course for undergraduates and medical students aimed at the intersection of medicine and the humanities. With the help of Harriet Sheridan, Brown Medical School continued to expand its reputation for training doctors not only to be meticulously scientific, but meticulously caring as well. When Dean Sheridan died of cancer in 1992, Dr. Epstein established this lectureship in her honor, and it's good to see Allison Buffum, Dr. Sheridan's daughter, and her husband Harry here today as always. The Sheridan Lectureship was the first of its kind in the United States. You should raise your hand. There they are. It was the first of its kind in the United States, a forum for the interdisciplinary exploration of doctors, doctoring, illness, and health in literature of all forms. Over the years, the Sheridan speakers have included novelists, surgeons, memoirists, neurologists, and poets, authors with an interest in medical humanities. This year's lecturer, Robert J. Lifton, is a worthy and celebrated 21st. So let me say a few words about Dr. Lifton. Dr. Robert J. Lifton is an optimist, but then all writers are optimists. The writers I know often brood and complain, they get distressed and go quiet, they threaten to quit writing, but they are really only talking to themselves. You can't begin a project that will last for years without a belief that you will pull something off, that in the end you will complete what you started, that you will find a way to offer the world something of interest. I like to think of Dr. Lifton as particularly optimistic, or a special kind of optimist, a writer who reveals his optimism in protean ways. It might seem strange that I would so characterize a man who has chosen as his life's work an exploration of the dark side of human behavior in this way. After medical school and a psychiatric residency, Lifton served as a psychiatrist in the Air Force. Stationed in Southeast Asia, he began to interview Western POWs subjected to thought reform by their Chinese captors. They'd been brainwashed, a fitting subject for a psychiatrist, at least one who began a detailed study of this phenomenon driven by his own curiosity. And with this first of 30 books, Robert J. Lifton became the diagnostician of a crazy world. He moved to Japan to study survivors of the atomic attack. He described a sense of special knowledge that set apart those who were at Hiroshima at the time of the bomb from those who were not witnesses. Special knowledge could be a coded term for the deep gouge in well-being these survivors suffered, but Lifton's interest was different. Early on, optimism shaped his text. This book, History of Survival, like his many others that follows, is about how individuals coped with extreme circumstance. In these first books, Lifton had staked his ground, the psychological impact of historical events. He was creating a new career track, a historically minded psychiatrist. In his writing, Lifton, like a true mental health worker, is attentive to thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. His methodology is the interview, although not the standard clinical kind, but rather one lasting hours or days. Nor are his case studies your standard mental patients. Nazi doctors, the subjects of his next large project, were not patients at all. Lifton argues that the Nazis employed physicians in the extermination program. One didn't need physicians to kill Jews, after all, because their participation would lend an aura of science and expertise to this unprecedented form of social cure. His book is a sustained attempt to interpret the psychology of the Nazi executioners and the process of socialization whereby ordinary doctors became killers who were doing away with life unworthy of life. He doesn't only report as a doctor or a journalist might. Dr. Lifton offers a theoretical model of genocide that has been applied to Armenia and Cambodia and Rwanda. Now, a man who studies genocide must be an optimist in at least this way. He can endure human horror. Lifton probes the psychology of evil, but optimistically, in search of a better self and how identity transformation occurs in the face of personal uncertainty and unmanageable historical forces. Lifton's enduring interest is in what I would call the self-event connection, how we take in and change or don't change in response to events that are changing the world around us. He wants to explain the relationship of omnipotence to vulnerability. He wants to understand how, even outside of historical storms, we lead a double life, afraid of death that arrives as fire bombs or drone strikes or global warming, but able to ignore it to establish a routine and live a life. He does not want us to go numb, and his books have a special meaning to doctors who, by the nature of our work, are at risk for their own form of psychic numbing, that is, in developing a diminished capacity or inclination to feel. Now, do you go into this line of work as an optimist, or does the study of costly events force any streak of optimism you have in you to the surface? My reading is that Dr. Lifton has always been appreciative of life at its best without ever wholly putting aside the possibility of life at its worst. As a psychiatrist, Dr. Lifton knows people are not simple. He sees the good in them. His message is optimistic, for it revolves around resilience, how one grows from personal pain. Resilience has within it always a core of optimism. He is optimistic as a writer and as an observer, and by disposition, finally, he is optimistic in the old-fashioned intellectual way. He believes that a scholar can be interested in everything. He can read everything. His books are filled with poetry and scenes from short stories and snippets of philosophy and psychoanalytic musings and art. He was hyperlinked before that word even existed. No domain is off limits. To read his books is to catch the spirit of continuous self-exploration. He does a form of translational research, not in the newest NIH version of translational research, that of taking our understanding of genes and molecular mechanism into the clinical realm, but a different form, translating scholarship into activism. Just as survivors seek deeper meaning in their lives, Lifton has brought his knowledge and experience to the larger world by taking stands. He gets politically involved in things that matter to him. He was an early and loud critic of the Vietnam War and more recently drone strikes. His lifelong passions include disarmament and social justice. His enemy is totalism, any religious or political system or regime which seeks an end to independent thought. Writer, doctor, activist, researcher, Robert J. Lifton is restless, a source of hope, a public figure. Some lives are admirable, some work is admirable. When a person and his work are both admirable, one can't help but be optimistic. Let me introduce to you my dear friend, Robert J. Lifton.
Thanks so much, Michael, for that generous, one might say, over-generous introduction. I'm very pleased to be part of this lecture series for many reasons, but mostly because it stands for matters I care very much about. It really charts an area that I've tried to live in intellectually. I'm grateful to Michael Stein and others here at Brown for every form of hospitality, also to Donna Arruda for her thoughtful help with arrangements. I've been made to feel in my day or so here at Brown completely at home. But still, one has to respond to an introduction like that, lest one begin to believe the things that are said in it. My way of responding is to quote my bird cartoons. Many of you may not know this, no reason why you should, but I have a little avocation of drawing bird cartoons. I have absolutely no artistic talent. They're kind of stick figures, but they can say things more directly than I can in my other writing. And so when people say, how do you study these draconian events and still remain sane, if one can make that assumption, my answer is that I draw bird cartoons. And the one that's appropriate for this moment is this. A small, enthusiastic young bird looks up and says, all of a sudden, I had this wonderful feeling, I am me. And an older, bigger, more jaundiced bird looks down at him and says, you were wrong. There's a serious idea in that little cartoon. Put simply, we need a sense of absurdity, sometimes gallows humor, to survive the absurdities in our world, and really to call forth generous doses of absurdity to help us cope with our feelings in terms of things that happen in this world. I gave as my title Researcher's Witness, and I want to say a word about that because it relates also to the inevitable, I think, necessity of relating scholarship to activism. When we do any kind of medical work, we know that we want to learn as much as we can to help our patients. We do research, we want to focus on knowledge that we can gain and be rigorous in our research methods so that what we find has some reliability. But there's another dimension to research, and perhaps to medical work in general, a dimension that we can call witness or bearing witness. And I say this as a secular person who's done research in what we call extreme situations involving collective struggles of extraordinary pressures or threats, struggles involving life and death on a considerable scale. And one has to note in doing this work that something significant is happening beyond one's immediate psychological findings of how people behave. So an atomic bomb was dropped in the center of a Japanese city, or German doctors trained to heal were involved in killing on a large scale. This kind of witness takes in an event or series of events that take place at a particular moment in a particular place in history, and then in some way one reconstructs and recreates them, tells their story, gives them a narrative. That's what witness is. And I have tried to do this in connection with Chinese thought reform or brainwashing, which I studied in Hong Kong in the mid-50s, the atomic bomb and its effects in Hiroshima in 1962, the Vietnam War experience with veterans I interviewed and worked with in the early 70s, and then Nazi doctors' reversal of healing and killing, which I studied in Germany and elsewhere in the late 70s and early 80s. And since then, I've tried to apply things that I've learned from those studies in more recent events, such as the psychology of drones and the nature of our response to climate change with reference to nuclear threat and a comparison of those two. Now, when one accrues research findings or data, at a certain place, a certain time in history, one gives it a narrative that comes partly from oneself. One is in that narrative in a significant way, so that one's own passions, one's own life is involved in the narrative one provides. We think of medical ethics, and rightly so, as involving responsibility to patients, taking measures that help and not harm them, and also providing at least a prevailing level of medical practice. But there's an ethics also in terms of where we hang out our shingle, where and how we choose to do medical work, whether it's a form of medical treatment or research, what we're doing in relation to patients or others in connection with medical work. We make that decision often without thinking about it, and yet it may be one of the most important decisions we make. And we all too readily assume, I believe, that because we're members of a healing profession, whatever we do is inherently good. That's not necessarily the case. The morality of our work has much to do with what we're part of, where we find ourselves in some particular group or institution, or working from unspoken ideas as part of a subculture with its own mores, which may be hidden. So research and medical work in general are no less an ethical enterprise than an intellectual one, and to acknowledge the moral dimension, we often take a public stand about it. Moral issues become involved, and that may clarify or strengthen our overall work. So I'm suggesting that there's much to be said for activism in association with scholarship. There's a great misconception about scholarship and social activism, an assumption that they may be antagonists because scholarship should be pure and free of moral passion. But I believe the opposite is true. Scholarship can be enriched and energized by relevant activism, and activism informed and deepened by rigorous scholarship. I'm going to say something about how I came to do the work that I've been doing, and some of my early struggles when I was trying to develop a sense of who I was and what I wanted to do as a physician and a psychiatrist. In my recent memoir, I talk about a moment in April of 1954 when I was 28 years old, and I embarked on a long walk through the streets of Kowloon, which is a crowded section of Hong Kong, walked around endlessly trying to make a decision. I'd been living in Hong Kong with my wife for 3 months, doing interviews that I found increasingly fascinating with Westerners, that is, Europeans and Americans who had been in Chinese prisons, and Chinese students and intellectuals at their universities or special centers, all of whom had been subjected to what was known as thought reform. The Chinese communists seeking to bring the beliefs and worldviews of people subjected to this process into accord with those of the triumphant communist regime. My decision that needed to be made was whether or not we could stay in Hong Kong because I was there alone in terms of intellectual connection, had just been released from 2 years in the Air Force, was fascinated with what I was doing, but also felt it was necessary for me to get back home to the business of my career, do what one was supposed to do in those days, have one's psychoanalytic training, open a practice, and embark upon a psychiatric career as understood. I came back to the hotel room, announced to my wife, we can't stay here. We were also running out of money, and I was getting nervous. So I said, we'll just have to return. But the next morning, I found myself writing up a research application to stay on in Hong Kong and continue the work. It was a strange contradiction. I realize now that at the time, I wanted very strongly to stay because I was deeply involved in work I was doing, but I couldn't see myself as somebody who should or could stay. It seemed to be a transgression. In any case, I did apply. I did find the means of staying, and that was the beginning of lots that followed in this struggle to bring together psychology and history. I sometimes, when one asks how I got to that point of being in Hong Kong, it of course had to do with my military service in the Far East, making an arrangement to be discharged in the Far East so that my wife and I could take a world trip, on which Hong Kong was only the second step, but having been interested in this issue because my last assignment in the Air Force was to interview with a group of other psychiatrists returning prisoners of war in Korea, where they were being returned, and then go on a sea journey on a ship taking them back to San Francisco, where I interviewed them further and had group sessions. And that was the source of my interest in what I found in Hong Kong. I sometimes say that the military liberated me from a conventional life, and I've never shown it much gratitude. This was a period in American life, not too long after World War II, when Americans were thrust out into the world. There was a kind of American hegemony that many of us were beginning to be nervous about and critical of, but nonetheless, we benefited from it in being given opportunities of this kind. When these POWs had returned, they were confused, and people were confused about their confusion. They had what was called a 1,000-mile stare, a kind of dissociation. Some of them mouthed Chinese communist phrases. They were edgy, and they were in an uncomfortable situation in returning to the military. When I immersed myself in the Hong Kong interviews, I realized that the POWs had been subjected to an export version of Chinese thought reform, which they applied much more intensely in China, on the mainland, to both Westerners who had been imprisoned and accused of being spies, and Chinese who were considered in some way insufficiently in tune with the new regime. There were two aspects to thought reform that fascinated me. One was the process of coercive change. Can you change people coercively? Does it last? How does that relate to psychotherapy, which we attempt to make the opposite of a coercive form of change? These were questions at the heart of my profession. There was another dimension, the historical dimension. This process of thought reform was applied in the early and mid-50s all over China, in prisons, in special centers, in universities, in neighborhood groups, everywhere in China, so that literally millions of people were subjected to this everywhere. And one of the observers called this one of the most spectacular events in human history. I was interested in that unique application of pressures that ran deep into the psyche on so extraordinary a scale. Well, I can't tell you all about it now, but I can say that it had some impressive dimensions, including extracting false confessions from prisoners, from Westerners in prison, and sometimes they could believe in their false confession. That's a useful observation because we see much talk about justification of torture on the part of the United States at times, with the claim that information can be obtained in that way alone. What one finds is that such information tends to be unreliable. because the main objective of somebody subjected to torture of various kinds is to end the pain and satisfy the interrogator, hence the false confessions and the process going deeper into the belief in false confessions. For the most part, thought reform in Westerners caused deep confusion. A small percentage who were alienated by it, some who were almost converted by it, but Westerners went back to environments of a non-communist nature and gradually reconnected with those environments. In China, it was different. The outcome has much to do with the context in which one finds oneself after the process. And there was one useful finding in all this, what I call the limitations of this kind of pressure or thought control, the hostility of suffocation, resentment on the part of people who were over-reformed. The Chinese got into the ironic situation of over-reforming because theirs was a religious-like movement. They couldn't stop reforming, and that caused resentments and what I call the law of diminishing conversions. In any case, the thought reform process, interestingly enough, is now much less used, that nobody would take it seriously in its exhortative element, but only in its punitive side. I personally could develop a method for doing this. It was a modified depth psychological interview that I've been taught in my psychiatric residency, modified in the direction of dialogue. And that became my method all through my work, along with a great deal of reading and study and consulting with people about Chinese culture, reading about Chinese history, and especially 20th century Chinese history and protest movements during that time. And I called this a mosaic approach. At the center was the interview, surrounded by the mosaic of information, which could enable one to better understand what one learned in that interview. I would emphasize that research is a considerable form of education. You know, we have our systematic studies in undergraduate and medical school work, but there's nothing like what the knowledge that one gains from struggling to understand a process that one is studying, that one has to learn about in order to understand what one is doing. And this takes one beyond earlier pedagogical information, and it may be the strongest form of motivation for anyone concerned with new knowledge. I came to realize that this was not just a Chinese proclivity, that this kind of totalism, all or none approach, claim of absolute truth and absolute virtue, was a human potential and a temptation. And I called it ideological totalism, following upon some work of Erik Erikson, who had described totalism in individual work and then in some work on the Nazis. And it had certain characteristics that I could discover and list, and I won't go into them, but they always included as much control of the environment, milieu control, as could be achieved. And the danger was the element of what I call dispensing of existence, the claim that some people who lack the desired convictions have no right to exist, and only those who pass muster in that way have that right. That could mean simply excluding people from favorable positions in society, or at its worst, it could be taking their lives. And totalism in its various phases then became central to my work in general, and I did a later study of Aum Shinrikyo, a fanatical cult in Japan, which in 1995 released sarin gas into Tokyo subways. I found it strange and ironic and interesting that this encounter with a closed, manipulative process opened out my life in a personal way. So the importance of thought reform to me then was an evolution of an identity of a psychiatrist out in the world who can do this kind of work, who can embark upon this kind of effort to combine psychology and history. And it also initiated and then continued totalism and ideological totalism as a leitmotif, so that the problem is not religion or politics. The problem is totalistic religion or totalistic politics, or for that matter, totalistic anything. I'll say a word about mentorship because that becomes important, I think, and maybe it's not thought about sufficiently now. I did the work on my own intellectually. I had had some psychiatric training, but I didn't have any real mentor or supervisor in doing the work. I had read Erik Erikson and admired his work when I was a resident, but it was not until after I did the work that I read one of his articles and had a kind of eureka experience, what he called identity or ego identity, and shifts possible in identity had to do with what I was observing among Chinese communists in their thought reform program. They were seeking to coercively change people's identity from the Confucian filial son or daughter to the contemporary filial communist. They had varying success, but that was the struggle that they were involved in and embarked in, and his work gave me a deeper perspective on what I was doing. And it also put the work in touch with a larger tradition, and a mentor can do all of that. Erikson really showed me that one can bring psychoanalysis and psychiatry into history, and that was crucial for me. And he also, in his own life, demonstrated something that I was struggling with, the duality of feeling towards psychoanalysis, seeing it on the one hand as a great intellectual movement of the late 19th and 20th centuries, and on the other hand, having become itself rigid and closed, at times totalistic, so that open study of history in this way could result in negating the very history one was seeking to study in favor of simplistic psychoanalytic concepts. Erikson changed all that in psychoanalysis, and that was a crucial part of his mentorship for me. I also learned in that work that the work of the follower has profound importance for the mentor. He was enormously interested in my work on thought reform, partly because it related to a study he was doing of Martin Luther in 16th century training for the Catholic seminary, and in that work he found thematic associations with what I was finding in Chinese thought reform, and that led to what came to be a lifelong dialogue between us. One doesn't necessarily have a single mentor. David Reisman, the extraordinary Chicago and then Harvard sociologist, was another mentor who had unlimited knowledge of American society, and I learned more with him on long walks through Fresh Pond Park in Cambridge than one could learn in a year of study of American society. And he also conveyed in his manner ways of being an American intellectual, applying one's knowledge to larger issues. And I had a third mentor whom I never met, the great mid-century French writer Albert Camus, whose book, The Rebel, was a revelation to me in the middle of this work. It's a brilliant and even lyrical critique of totalism. At the same time as Camus took a stand in terms of the name of his protagonist, the rebel, a stand against, or a stand that always was critical of the status quo. There was a temptation then in American life to become simply an anti-communist intellectual, as though that solved everything. Camus showed how one could be anti-communist, anti-totalist, that is, and at the same time a critical and rebellious intellectual. So mentorship allows one to immerse oneself in existing knowledge and have an invitation to, in some way, take steps beyond it. Mentors' ideas provide a standard or a baseline from which one moves, and there's then the interesting tension always involved in mentorship between accepting the ideas of the mentor and moving beyond those ideas into one's own areas, a tension that both become aware of. And in our time, mentorship, like everything else, may be multiple, or in the language I've used that Michael Stein mentioned, protean, many-sided, can be also sporadic and geographically dispersed. You can have mentors in different places and at different times. I want to say something about two studies that became extremely important to me, the one in Hiroshima and the one of Nazi doctors, mostly in Germany. One important question for me was how I got to Hiroshima, and there, just to put it simply, one assumes often that one takes up a study, learns something from it, and develops a moral position in relation to it. I think it's often the opposite, in which it's one's moral or ethical concerns that take one to a certain kind of study, and then one deepens all of that in the research or knowledge that one finds or seeks. And I got to Hiroshima having been in Japan for 2 years before that doing a psychological study of young Japanese, because in the Reisman circle, in that mentorship with David Reisman, he was enormously, and some others around him, involved in nuclear weapons, politically opposed to them quite passionately, but also intellectually opposed, determined to use his knowledge to uncover what they were doing to American society. And that was a time of the formation of what we now call the national security state, based on nuclear weapons. So I learned that one could take one's professional knowledge and bring it to bear on central issues, not just in an immediate political way, but in a scholarly way as well. In any case, I could stay in Hiroshima without conflict. It was 8 years later, I had a method. I had some achievements and some confidence in at least doing that, but that doesn't mean it was without difficulty, because after talking to many people in Hiroshima about the atomic bomb, when I did my first actual interviews with victims and survivors, it was quite different. In the first interview, I spoke to somebody who had been 13 years old when he experienced the bomb. His mother had rescued him from the debris. He tried to take her as she got weak, couldn't carry her, escaped without her, never overcame that vision of her dying in the debris, had his baby brother and grandparents both die of acute radiation effects, the petechiae into the skin that were so terrifying to people, and his father perished in the fire, became an orphan, and lived a life of dislocation and pain and really unrelenting suffering. And I heard a few stories like that, and I found myself anxious, having difficulty sleeping, having nightmares. And I began to think that it would be impossible to stay and do the study. I knew it was important, but I really wondered whether I would be able to do it. I was struggling under duress to hold on to my research function. But then a few days later, I found that I could begin to feel myself changing. I could listen to people, try to understand with the significance of what they were saying and feeling, and go on with the study. I was puzzled by my own reaction. I called it psychic numbing, diminished capacity to feel, but in this case, selective professional numbing, an element of slight distancing. One could certainly still experience pain, but some degree of distancing, perhaps parallel to that which a surgeon feels when he's operating and can't afford to feel the emotions of a family member, or even someone in my profession, a psychiatrist, dealing with an extremely disturbed patient. And in that way I could continue and learned a great deal about several aspects of this kind of work, including this selective professional numbing, but also the necessity to pace oneself in the work. One has to do what one can, not overextend oneself in terms of one's emotional reservoir. In Hiroshima, there weren't too many heroes, but several of them were physicians. One man named Hachiya, who wrote famous Hiroshima Diary at the time of the bomb, another man named Shigeto, who did extraordinary work over decades with so-called A-bomb disease, that is, conditions believed created by delayed radiation effects. What I learned in Hiroshima quickly was that in a split second in time, one exposed to that weapon, which was undoubtedly the cruelest weapon in human history, was subjected to a lifelong immersion in death. From the sea of death at the time of the bomb, acute radiation effects, as I mentioned them, delayed radiation effects, which came to cause increased incidence in leukemia and many cancers, and then the fear that the radiation effects could extend over subsequent generations, because that was theoretically possible. The identity of the so-called hibakusha, meaning explosion-affected person, which was, in those days, death-dominated. I also learned about survivors and their quest for meaning, central to all survivor experience, and I thought a lot about human beings as meaning-hungry creatures, and survivors in Hiroshima could recover, show some resilience, try to marry and have children and affirm life, but also could do that in a more political sense of becoming witnesses, telling their tale, traveling around the world, as many have, and in that sense benefiting the world in that warning about what they had been through, while at the same benefiting themselves by giving meaning through this witness to an otherwise unmanageable experience. And I, in that sense, was a witness to their witness. I'll mention just a part of one interview because it said so much in terms of what affected me later on. I interviewed one man who had experienced the bomb on the outskirts of the city, could look down from a hill into the city, and he said this to me. He said, "I climbed over Hijiyama Hill and looked down. I saw that Hiroshima had disappeared. Of course, I saw many dreadful scenes, but that experience, looking down and finding nothing left of Hiroshima, was so shocking that I simply couldn't express what I felt. I saw a few buildings in the distance, but Hiroshima didn't exist. That was mainly what I saw. Hiroshima just didn't exist." As he said this, I found myself imagining a medium-sized city and then nothing. And that image stayed in me. I spoke of it as one plane, one bomb, one city. And that was a small weapon by current standards. It was interesting that this man advocated as a form of commemoration that the whole area around the hypocenter be cleared out and nothing be put there. As he said, the atomic bomb is a story of everything becoming nothing, and that's what should be commemorated. It's often been pointed out that there were more people killed in a long night of American strategic bombing of Tokyo in March of 1945 than were killed in Hiroshima. But there were large numbers of planes and bombs. In Hiroshima, it was one plane, one bomb, one city. While working in Hiroshima, finishing up my work there, I was startled to read an English language Japanese paper about American physicians in Boston taking a stand against atomic weapons by projecting what would happen if, say, a 1 or 5 megaton bomb were dropped on Watertown Square in Boston or some such designated place. And they published these articles in 1962 in the New England Journal of Medicine. And this was the beginning formation of Physicians for Social Responsibility. And I was thrilled at reading this, and I felt these were colleagues in the deepest sense, and I did join them when I got back. When it comes to my study of Nazi doctors, it's different from others. It was more painful. It was really more hands-on evil, naked, so to speak. Nonetheless, it was something that I concerned myself with for many years. The difficulty was expressed to me by a Jewish, originally Czech, survivor of Auschwitz who had helped people in Auschwitz as a prisoner himself when prisoner doctors were given the opportunity to do a little bit of medicine in the last year of the death camp. And he looked at me as I sat down with him and talked to him, because I did interview prisoner doctors as well. He looked at me and he said, "You know, Robert, I've been involved in this problem for more than 40 years, and I still can't believe that it really happened. That anyone would try to round up all the Jews in Europe and then send them to a place to kill them." There's something about that dimension of evil that is not believable, in the sense that we have grave difficulty taking it in. And of course, that helps the Holocaust deniers who have their own agenda, often a fascist or neo-fascist agenda. But of course, he knew that it had happened. He had suffered, and he had for 40 years studied ways of helping survivors. I knew it had happened also, but there are moments when one, after whatever exposure one has had, doubts that such a thing can really take place. I work not so much on the more talked about behavior of Nazi doctors, the notorious experiments they did on living patients and with lethal results in some cases, but rather their role in the killing function and in the reversal of healing and killing. And it is of, I think, some significance, particularly to physicians and to scientists, that the Nazis saw their whole mission as what I called a biomedical one. That is, Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf that the Nordic race had once been strong and thriving, had been infected by admixture with inferior races such as the Jewish race, that the Nordic race was the only culture creating race. The other races could sustain but not create culture. The, quotes, Jewish race was a destroyer of culture. So something had to be done about the Jews and the, quotes, Jewish race in order to render the Nordic race again strong, in order to cure the Nordic race. The Jews had to be dealt with. One could say that everything the Nazis did, including their war-making, had the trappings of a biological or biomedical vision in which the genes had to be purified to help the world. And one doctor whom I interviewed said to me, "I joined the Nazi Party the day after I heard a leading Nazi, it was Rudolf Hess, who said, 'National Socialism is nothing but applied biology.'" Some could believe in this extreme view. Not all Nazi doctors by any means. The vanguard could believe in this extreme ideology. The rank and file of Nazi doctors, like the rank and file of Nazis, were socialized to evil. They became part of a group and a dominant theme and ethos which they adapted to, and in that sense were corruptible. And here I learned about the vulnerability of doctors to this form of corruption, to some reversal of healing and killing, which was so extremely manifested by the Nazis. Look at the Soviet psychiatrists. diagnosing dissidents as mentally ill, incarcerating them in hospitals. Japanese doctors performed vivisection during World War II on American and other prisoners. They even rivaled the Nazis. There were South African doctors during apartheid who falsified medical reports on blacks tortured or killed in prison. There were the notorious Tuskegee syphilis experiments from 1932 to 1972 by American doctors, adult blacks who were allowed to be observed untreated over that time. And then there were American doctors performing unethical, sometimes lethal experiments with drugs during the Cold War in their fascination with, quotes, brainwashing or mind control. So we doctors have a shamanistic legacy, and the shaman, you know, could go either way. He could kill or he could heal. And even in Greek origins of medicine, we forget that Asclepius, who's a great hero of ours, he apparently took one fluid from the Gorgon, the monster that killed, or another fluid that healed. There seems to be a mythic recognition that doctors can indeed go either way. And Nazi doctors would undergo what I call doubling, forming a functional second self, so that doctors who did selections at Auschwitz, which they'd select people from the trains, put most of them to the gas chamber, Jews arriving, and select people in the camps, and oversee the function of the gas chamber so that they or their assistants would pronounce people dead, took overall charge of the killing process in Auschwitz. Those same doctors could do that 6 days a week, then go back from Poland to Germany for a weekend or for a leave, R&R in their terms, and where they would then be ordinary fathers and husbands. Perhaps, as some of them described this to me, it was not a perfect blend, but they could maintain those two separate functional selves sufficiently to go on doing what they did, and in that way, doubling is a form of dissociation, as is numbing, and these various forms of dissociation are part of the human repertoire that enable people to adapt to evil. It becomes a means of performing evil while still keeping an aspect of one's prior self. I don't have time to do too much discussion. I'll just mention some of the kinds of interviews I had in which, in addition to encounters with particular Nazi doctors, some of the interviews had historical significance. One was with a psychiatrist, a neuropsychiatrist, who treated what he called killer troops, Einsatzgruppen, who notoriously were responsible for the murder of 1.5 million Jews in Eastern Europe by direct killing. They just lined them up and shot them with automatic weapons. And he told me that 20% or so of the soldiers so assigned would have psychological problems. Maybe half of those would have terrible moral compunctions. The others would just think it was a terrible job. But this was the kind of report that Himmler received from his generals that led him to work harder on getting the gas chambers ready as a method that was easier for the killers to sustain. And that was the case. They struggled with it, and some had conflicts in Auschwitz, but they could eventually do what they did. And that, of course, had that kind of historical significance. I also interviewed an elderly Nazi doctor who, toward the end of the second interview, broke down in tears. And I was surprised. He'd been fairly articulate, hadn't shown anything like this. And for about 30 seconds, there were just these sobs. What had happened, the reason, putting it briefly, was that he had been a distinguished university doctor, had become involved with experiments tangentially, had been convicted and imprisoned by an international court, and he wanted to recover his good name. He even asked me whether I would invite him to Yale, where I then taught so that he could give a lecture and be respected. And of course, I didn't agree to his request. But at this second interview, he realized he would never clear his name, and more than that, his rationale of having helped the Nazis became unconvincing even to himself. So he broke down and wept, and then the question is, what did I do? Ordinarily, you know, when you're in psychiatric work and someone weeps, you bring out the Kleenex or say something reassuring. But in this case, I at first wondered why he did, then I understood why he did. It was not without a certain satisfaction that I felt. I didn't want to do harm to him, and I didn't want to help him, so I just did nothing and let him weep. And this had to do also with my research protocol. It's of ironic but interest, but appropriate, that when I embarked on the research with Nazi doctors, I had to work it out with the Yale Committee on Research with Human Subjects, and of course promise informed consent to people I interviewed, and also that I would do them no harm during the interviews. And I felt responsible to that protocol, even though ironically it was these same Nazi doctors who, through the Nuremberg medical trials, made it necessary to create these protocols. Well, Nazi doctors never expressed remorse to me. And as I discussed it with colleagues who had worked on some of these issues in Germany, German colleagues, one could say that they could not take in the dimension of evil they had been associated with, and in some ways tried to see themselves as victims of a movement, or of the Russians who later came in. They had, the ones that I saw, mostly a certain measure of psychic numbing or distancing, spoke about some details of what went on and even what they did, but as if they were a third person, looking at that man together with me from a distance, another form of dissociation, as they tried to pass themselves off as a conservative burgher who at that time got caught in a difficult situation and tried to behave well. Of course, they knew that I wasn't accepting that version of themselves, but they revealed a great deal of useful information to me in the process. Unfortunately, one of the saddest moments in my life was when I discovered, as there became evidence available, that American doctors had been engaging, colluding in torture in Iraq and other places during the Iraq War, colluding by not reporting wounds that could only have been caused by abuse, by falsifying death certificates of people who had died from abuse, and perhaps worst of all, by joining with interrogators, as did psychologists and psychiatrists, in interrogation methods that spilled over into torture in the effort to extract information. In a democratic society, we can expose this and we can take other directions, but it's not easy, and it requires a kind of confrontation that no American in high places has been able yet to advocate or bring about. Okay, to move toward my conclusion, let me say that when you've done as much work with bad doctors as I have, you especially value good doctors. And I have a very simple definition of a good doctor, one who is consistently a healer. It turns out that there were true healers in Auschwitz, not among the Nazi doctors, but one found them among the prisoner physicians, as I've suggested. They were mostly Jewish, but some were Polish, non-Jews, or non-Jewish German political prisoners. And it was a very different atmosphere when I interviewed people in these groups, because I felt myself in a kind of colleagueship in uncovering what had happened in Auschwitz. It was interesting that Nazi doctors tried to befriend prisoner doctors and talk to them about medical issues or medical articles, because it was a way of trying to sustain their own sense of themselves as physicians when all they were doing in Auschwitz was killing. But of course, it was a very uneven, unequal relationship, and physicians had to be wary in the extreme. The most poignant and painful problem for inmate physicians was when a Nazi physician said, "I'm going to select 20 people from your medical block tomorrow morning." That means 20 people selected for the gas chamber from the little medical block where inmate doctors were trying to keep a few people alive. If they cooperated with them, that would be cooperating in Nazi killing. If they didn't cooperate, the Nazi doctor might choose people who had a chance to live rather than those who had no chance whatsoever to live, as could be apparent. So there could be a triage component to it, and they try to consult with each other to, in some way, do as best they could. There are some situations that are themselves evil, and there's no good solution. I realized that my interviewing inmate doctors, which I originally did for the conscious purpose of their observations on Nazi doctors, especially in Auschwitz, but I also realized later that I interviewed them for a kind of spiritual support and interaction. And of course, I identified with them. They were rather like me, maybe 10 years older, but middle-class, Jewish, reasonably well-educated people who went through medical school. And I knew that if it weren't for an active history in which my grandparents elected or were able to emigrate and come to this country, instead of staying there as theirs did, I could have been on the other end of the interview or worse. There's another group of doctors that I put strongly and proudly in the realm of good doctors. I mean the Doctors Anti-Nuclear Movement, originally Physicians for Social Responsibility, and then extending internationally, IPPNW, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War, formed essentially the latter group, internationalized by Bernard Lown and Evgeny Shazov, both of them leading cardiologists in the United States and the Soviet Union, respectively. And in this group, much happened, and it was one of those moments in which there was a vast readiness for a change in consciousness, and I think the doctors' movement helped achieve that, and then was awarded the Nobel Prize, as you know. There was a toast that we would make at every meeting, and we would meet in Helsinki or in London or Boston or places all over the world, and we would do what we did in the national movement, tell what would happen when a bomb of a certain strength would fall on the city in which we were having our conference. A toast would be made at every such meeting, and it could be made either by an American doctor or by a Soviet doctor. It was the same toast. And the toast was, "I drink to the survival of each of you, of your leaders, and of all of your countrymen, because if you survive, we survive, and if you die, we die." So, you know, it's not a joyous toast, but it has the essence of universality, the essence of what the doctors' movement was about. There was a dramatic moment at the press conference when the Peace Prize was received by the two leading American and Soviet doctors. A Soviet journalist had an acute episode of cardiac arrest, and the cardiologists from both countries rushed to him, took care of him, saved his life, making use of a device that had actually been invented by Lown for this kind of situation. And Lown called it a strange parable of IPPNW itself, meaning a kind of a dangerous world that could be moribund, where one steps in to try to do something about it. Let me close by saying that this kind of collective expression of medical healing, which we see in IPPNW, PSR, also in Physicians for Human Rights, very active now in exposing torture all over the world and suffering of civilians. Doctors have an important part to play in this, all the more so as we improve, indeed revolutionize, our technology of killing. And I believe that each of us who becomes a doctor has some small corner of idealism in relation to healing, however it may be blurred and seemingly eliminated by our susceptibility to the pressures and contradictions of our medical system, and there are plenty of them. None of us comes out completely pure, but as individuals and as groups, we can commit ourselves to still unfolding ethical possibilities. There are more collective ethical possibilities on the part of physicians that are developing even as we continue in this kind of dialogue. Sometimes fictional characters can say these things best, so I'll conclude with the words of Dr. Rieu, who's a character created by Alfred Camus in his great novel, The Plague. Rieu had there was a plague in a North African city. It was a representation of evil in Camus' work. Rieu had tended his patients faithfully through a terrible plague epidemic and turned out to be the narrator of the volume. And he reveals himself as the epidemic subsides, and as Camus puts it, Dr. Rieu resolved to compile this chronicle to bear witness in favor of those plague-stricken people. He knew that the tale he had to tell could not be one of final victory, but only the record of what had to be done, and what assuredly would have to be done again in the never-ending fight against terror, by all who, while unable to be saints, strive their utmost to be healers. Thank you.
How about two questions?
I wonder if you know the film La Combe-Lucien, French film about a German boy in World War II who wants to join the French resistance, but he's not allowed to because he's thought to be unreliable. So he joined the Gestapo instead. Do you do not know the film? Can you not understand me?
What is the film?
La Combe-Lucien.
Maybe you could tell me what. What's that?
La Combe-Lucien.
I don't think so.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Or just speak loud.
I'm very curious, this is perhaps tangential to your work, but I'm very curious about trauma writing, and specifically the work of survivors of the sarin gas attack, which you mentioned earlier. And so I was curious if you had any thoughts on whether writing about personal trauma can have therapeutic effects or be psychologically beneficial for the author or even the readers.
The question is whether writing
Can writing about trauma be beneficial to the person?
traumatized.
About personal
Yeah.
trauma.
I think so. I mean, of course, it depends on the circumstance, and probably writing about it with some response, some interaction matters. The trauma is similar to what I called a struggle of survivors for meaning, trying to grasp what meaning they can give to what they've been subjected to. And writing about it or speaking about it or sharing it with others can all serve to develop such meaning and can be steps toward recovery. Okay.
Last one.
What do you think the role of the internet is in regards to totalism? Keeping in mind the NSA record keeping, the use of social media in the Arab Spring, and the use of censorship by different governments?
It's a good question. The role of the internet in relation to totalism. I don't think we know yet. The internet is still relatively new. What we can say is that the technologies for surveillance in general are mushrooming, are exploding. I'm using violent words, but that's what's happening, and the temptations seem to be irresistible to many of our leaders to embrace that high technology of surveillance. What the results will be, I'm not sure, but I do think, and this is perhaps implied in your question, that it's our duty as citizens to question this being done, to demand from our leaders information about exactly what they're doing, which they haven't been quick to give us, much of which came through revelations of Snowden as a whistleblower. But it's our right and task as a citizen to question this before we know the ultimate significance. It's not likely to be beneficial, and we shouldn't wait until more things have happened before we speak out.